Oh, cheese, Tong. Can you take this?
อันนั้นจับแล้วใช่ไหมสองคน
Okay. Ready to go? You put this thing on?
Thank you. That's great. Can I get everyone to return? Excuse me, can I get everyone to return to your seats so we can get started? Yeah. Not too bad. Not too bad. All right. So we're going to start, and if you could, please work your way back and grab a chair. I'm just delighted that we have Governor Dukakis with us, Michael Dukakis, two-term governor of Massachusetts. I should say they were not consecutive.
Actually, three. One.
So, and then in 1988, the Democratic Party presidential nominee. Governor Dukakis ran a truly decent campaign in 1988 and ran up against a campaign that was not quite in that category. Strategists like Lee Atwater, in some ways playing a different kind of game than Americans had seen before, and sadly has become the game. Increasingly, that's the way that our politics look. And the theme of the conference is political reconciliation. We have a pretty substantial divide at the moment in the United States. And it's kind of new territory. It's certainly different than the North-South divide that Steve Walt was talking about after the Civil War. It's not that kind of depth. But when it comes to partisan politics in this country, there's a much deeper divide than a decade ago, certainly than 3 decades ago. And it's kind of hard to look out there at the landscape and figure out exactly what's going to kind of bridge some of those divides. And Governor, love to have your thoughts.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you all very much. Where are the Greek speakers here? Got a few? A Greek speaker there? What happened to, it's Denise Bandy. What happened to her? She just asked a question. Anyway, it's good to be here and to be part of this. Remember, I am not an expert on American politics. If I were, I'd be here in another capacity, former president. So don't assume that I know anything more than you do. But I have been involved, as Tom said, actively in political life pretty much all of my adult life. And these days I teach mostly at Northeastern University and in the winter at UCLA in Los Angeles. So I have an opportunity to at least do some thinking about all of this. But let me begin by saying that polarization, political polarization, is nothing new in American politics. But if you go back to 1789, when the American Republic was first founded, the politics were very, very tough. The media didn't even make a pretense of being objective, completely partisan. Thomas Jefferson, when he left the presidency after 8 years, said that it was the best day of his life, I'm paraphrasing Tom, because he no longer had to put up with the jackals of the press. Political polarization has been a part of American political life for a long, long time. The period leading up to the Civil War for decades was a period of increasing polarization. Professor Walt talked about the North-South divide, as Thomas called it. There was nothing more deeply dividing than what happened between two sections of the country. And in point of fact, we went to war over it. It's the bloodiest war in American history. And there was not a great deal of reconciliation, not only during the Reconstruction period. Remember, people of color in this country, for the most part, couldn't exercise their political rights until decades, almost 100 years after the war itself, despite the passage of constitutional amendments which abolished slavery and presumably guaranteed constitutional rights to everybody, including the right to vote. Ladies, women in this country really didn't have political rights until several decades after the Civil War. And the women's suffrage issue was a deeply dividing issue. The temperance issue, drinking, liquor, was one of the most divisive issues in American history. There's a wonderful new book called Last Call, which is the history of Prohibition. We don't even remember it. We don't even teach it these days to our kids. But the whole issue of the legality and the consumption of liquor and the sale and distribution of liquor was a incredibly divisive issue in this country. You were either a dry or you were a wet. And people were defeated at the ballot box. We actually decided that we would attempt to eliminate drinking effectively in the United States. It was a terrible idea, and we repealed it. But and it produced not only division, corruption, all kinds of things. And if you really want to see some polarization, read the editorials of the Wall Street Journal in the 1930s about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I mean, we still aren't looking at things like that these days. And Roosevelt, by the way, gave as good as he got. I mean, he was a tough guy, and there's no words about all of this. And more recently, at least in my lifetime, the so-called McCarthy period was a terrible period in American history. It was this guy, the senator from Wisconsin, running around accusing people of being unpatriotic, disloyal, subversive. Careers were lost. It was a terrible period. And in fact, I graduated from Swarthmore College in 1955. I was drafted into the military about a month later. And 2 days after I got into the military, got into the Army, I had what passes for a personnel interview in the United States Army. There are other young military folks who are personnel specialists. And the guy that interviewed me for my personnel interview had a dossier on me with every bit of political activity that I'd engaged in during my young life. And I was just this kid from Boston who had just spent 4 years at Swarthmore College. He knew I was the chairman of the Students for Democratic Action, which was the student wing of the Americans for Democratic Action. He knew that I had run a fundraiser for the American Civil Liberties Union. It was all there 2 days after I arrived there. And in point of fact, I had a very dear friend who also graduated from Swarthmore with me and also came from Brookline, Massachusetts, who was held indefinitely for about a year at Fort Dix and was almost discharged, other than honorably, because he had been a member of something called the United World Federalists, which was an organization that believed in a world government. So there's nothing new about political polarization in the United States. We've had it. And it ebbs and it flows. Now, when I was an undergraduate at Swarthmore, 1950s, the political parties in this country were rather interesting creatures, because the Democrats had their liberals and the Democrats had their conservatives, and the Republicans had their liberals and the Republicans had their conservatives. And it was a little difficult to try to figure out how you ought to vote, because what would you get if you voted Republican? What would you get if you voted Democrat? And so whole flock of political scientists, led by a guy named Schatzsnyder, began arguing that it was time that the political parties in the United States began to stand for something. And here were the Democrats with liberals like Hewitt Humphrey and southern white racist Democrats who were to the right of the Republicans. And they were all Democrats. Now were these Southerners Democrats? Because they hated the Republicans? Because they blamed the Republicans for the Civil War? And on the Republican side, although it was more conservative generally, we had very, very liberal Republicans. A fellow named Wayne Morse from Oregon was as liberal as anybody in the United States Senate. John Lindsay, who was a Republican congressman from New York City and subsequently the mayor of New York. And these folks were very, very liberal. They were Republicans. So Schatzsnyder and others argued that that didn't make any sense. Parties ought to stand for something. And it was time for party realignment. In other words, it was time that the Democratic Party stood for something. So if you voted Democratic, you knew what you were getting, and the Republican Party ought to stand for something. So if you voted Republican, you knew what you were getting. And in point of fact, that's what's happened in the United States. Everything that Schatzsnyder suggested, we've done. And now we're very unhappy because we have all this polarization. Because the parties stand for something. Now, what do they stand for? Well, generally speaking, I think it's fair to say that the difference between the political parties in the United States is fairly simple. Democrats believe in using government more to achieve social and economic goals than Republicans. Republicans prefer to look to the private sector, and I think Republicans would probably agree with that definition. And so, these days in the Congress of the United States, or for that matter in the White House, Democrats tend to be, as this president is, a lot more willing to use government to achieve social and economic goals than his opponent, Governor Romney. And the same is true of the congressional membership. And now everybody's unhappy. I guess maybe they think we ought to go back to the pre-Schatzsnyder era. Now, I don't want to exaggerate this because the American people are, for the most part, politically moderate. There is not this kind of division across the population generally. Yeah, there are very liberal people in the United States, very conservative people in the United States, but generally speaking, this country tends to be pretty moderate. So sooner or later, the parties have to reflect that moderation. And by the way, it's happening right now in this election. In the Republican primary in Indiana, a thoughtful, moderate, strongly internationalist veteran United States Senator named Dick Lucar was defeated by the state treasurer who was a far-out Tea Party guy. That guy is now in trouble politically because he is so extreme. So he's now saying, well, I really want to be bipartisan. Now, I don't know him. I don't know whether he's serious or whether or not he's just saying this because he's in trouble politically. As a matter of fact, his Democratic opponent, Congressman Donnelly, said, well, okay, if you're going to be bipartisan, what Democratic senator do you plan to work with? He couldn't come up with the name of anybody. So I think this is a relatively new thought for him. But it looks as if, and there's nothing new about this, that as we get closer and closer to Election Day, these sharp edges are moderating a bit, especially on the Republican side. We will see. But don't get me wrong. If Romney and the Republicans take over the Congress and the White House, I don't imagine we're going to have an awful lot of moderation if Obama wins. And especially if the Democrats at least hold on to the Senate, which may happen. We'll see. Then I think, again, this extreme polarization is likely to moderate somewhat, and I think you're going to see significantly greater bipartisan consensus building, at least among some people, on both the Democratic and Republican side, if in point of fact that happens. So I guess I simply want to say to all of you that there is nothing new about this. It's been pretty sharp over the course of the past few years, but there is something about the American political environment that seems to tend to move us back toward a degree of moderation after we have these outbreaks of polarization. Now, you've just heard from Professor Walt, who's terrific, and I'm not sure there is as much polarization when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. I have to say to you, however, that there are at least some of us on the Democratic side who are not happy with the direction of foreign policy and national security that we've seen now, especially during the Bush years. But I'm not sure the Obama administration, which I like and respect a lot and want very much to see reelected, is moving as rapidly as I would like away from the kind of Cold War mentality that we've had in this country for a long time and that we still have. I happen to be a confirmed internationalist. In fact, I said during the '88 campaign that I was a multilateralist, unapologetically. It sounded almost pornographic. Bush came after me. This guy's a multilateralist. Fortunately, George H.W. Bush also was a multilateralist, unlike his son. So we did have a period then, toward the end of the Cold War and the post-Cold War era, where under both Bush 1 and Clinton, American foreign policy and national security policy seemed to take on what I thought was a more reasonable, thoughtful, and internationally consensus-building approach. I can't say the same for Bush 2. I thought Bush was the worst president in my lifetime, but more than that, simply didn't understand or believe that the United States could use its authority and its strength to try to build international institutions of reconciliation. And I believe that should be a major focus of American foreign policy these days. A lot of you in this room know a lot more about foreign policy than I do. But, for example, all of a sudden we seem to have a lot of disputes over property in the South China Sea. Have you noticed? It's Vietnam and China, Korea and Japan, China and the Philippines. Why aren't we urging all of those countries to go to the International Court of Justice? That's what it's created to do. And in doing so, not only help them to resolve these differences, but to build the credibility of the world court. Instead, we're running around all over the place, trying to negotiate this, that, and the other thing. I don't understand this. I want to see my country working hard to try to build international institutions that can, in fact, achieve reconciliation between and among countries. Now, I'm not a empty-headed idealist. I mean, I understand this is an interesting world, but strange as it may sound, it's the most peaceful world I've ever lived in, folks. And I was born in 1933. But I'm particularly committed to the notion that the United States ought to be a builder of that kind of reconciliation. I don't mean just in terms of what we say, but in trying to build international institutions that can, in fact, achieve that. Every time we act unilaterally, the U.S., we get our heads handed to us. You notice? We've been doing it for a long time. Overthrowing the democratically elected government of Iran in 1953 has to be one of the dumbest things the United States has ever done. Maybe even dumber than invading Iraq. And look what it produced. Look what it produced. I don't know if anyone knows anything about Iran that doesn't think that if we had stayed out of that thing, had not done what we had done, which, by the way, went directly against our expressed values, Iran would be a very different place these days, and we would not be dealing with the kinds of issues that we're currently facing in Iran. I mean, the invasion of Iraq was the second dumbest thing we ever did. And one would think that we'd learn some lessons from this. It's an old Greek expression, pathima mathema. It even rhymes. Fatima. Things happen. Mathima, you're supposed to learn from. And we're not alone in this. We seem to have a difficult time learning from history. And that's why we study history, to learn from it. So I believe the United States can be a great force for reconciliation and for the resolution of differences between among countries. But there's a history lesson here. When we do so in concert with the international community, we tend to be effective. When we don't, we get into trouble. And that's particularly true when we try to use military power. We have some people here from Africa. Well, we've got a new institution. It's called AFRICOM. Any of you heard of AFRICOM? Nobody knows about AFRICOM? We have a new U.S. African military command. And one of our top generals is about to take it over. I mean, I don't know, folks. I would have hoped that the Organization of African States, with strong support from the United Nations, could be developed in a way that might help to reconcile some issues in Africa. Does the American military have to have an African military command to do this? I'm troubled by this. I'm troubled by the idea that we've got to be a military presence everywhere. And in any event, folks, we can't afford it. We can't afford it. We can't pay for this stuff. 837 American bases in 150 countries. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So, to sum up, before we open things up, polarization is not a new thing in the United States. We've gone through a period here, relatively short, where we've seen a good deal of it. Depending on what happens at the ballot box in 45 days, we may find that that polarization moderates substantially. We'll see. And on the international scene, I would hope that my country would be a force for reconciliation. In my view, that means working hard with the international community to try to build international institutions that advance the cause of reconciliation and don't fracture. And all of us have to be a part of this. This is not something the United States can do by itself. You know, when you start calling yourself the world's only superpower, look up, look up. You're going to get into trouble. That's not the role that we ought to be trying to assume. But a force for reconciliation, for building international institutions that can, over a long period of time, be effective in doing that, that's a role that I hope and expect that my country will play. And if the president's reelected, my hope is that he'll lead that. I must say I'm a little concerned about what seems to be this paranoia about China. You know, everything we buy from China. Everything we borrow from China. They're spending about 1/6 the amount of money we're spending on the military. I don't quite understand this. And frankly, I think it's a hangover to the Cold War. We still haven't been able to get out of this notion that we got to have an enemy someplace. And I think it's, frankly, it's on the result of decades of a Cold War, which is a very interesting guy over at Boston University named Andrew Basevich, who was a West Pointer, a career military guy, lost a son, was a young lieutenant in Iraq, now teaches there, wrote a book called Perpetual War. Read it. Read it. This is a military guy warning us of this apparent inclination of ours to consider the world as perpetually at war, and we having to be a part of that war. I think we can do better than that. And if we're all serious about the notion of reconciliation in this world of ours, and I hope we are, I think the United States can play a very constructive role, but we've got to understand what that role is and pursue it. And I'm not sure we've been doing that very effectively over the course of the past decade or so. Anyway, let me stop at this point and open things up.
Okay, let me ask the first question. It might be helpful to explain a little bit to this audience how some of the peculiarities of the American political system. I agree with your reading of history. I agree also that this is largely a moderate country. But we have some things in our political system that allow intense minorities to create more than a little mischief. And a couple of those would be money, and where that money goes in campaigns. And then we also have, which few other countries have, are these primary elections where we have a much smaller electorate. By definition, primaries are one-sided. Talk a little bit so they have a little sense of kind of where that kind of plays into some of the divisions and the maintenance of those divisions in the party system.
Good point, John. And also, historically, you have to understand the origin of American political institutions and the federal government. You know, some scholars say that the reason the Canadians are much more willing to use government to achieve social and economic goals is because all the Tories went to Canada. All the monarchists, all the royalists. The rebels stayed here. And the rebels didn't like government. They distrusted government. They wanted weak government. And they created a government in 1787 that was designed, frankly, to ensure gridlock unless the need for action was absolutely compelling. So we did have a parliamentary system. We do not have a parliamentary system. We have the so-called separation of powers among three branches of government. The only reason that the presidency under the original Constitution, I was about to say it was relatively powerful, but it wasn't emasculated, was because the presiding officer at the Constitutional Convention was a guy named George Washington. And everybody knew he was going to be the first president of the United States, and he was held in great respect. And those 55 white guys who met in secret in Philadelphia to draft the Constitution had enormous respect for him and thought it would be almost insulting if they had a presidency which was constrained, as, by the way, it was under the Articles of the Confederation, which was the first American Constitution, where the president not only had no power at all, but there was a new president every year elected by the 13 states. I mean, there was no executive branch to speak of. So, if you're wondering why Congress doesn't seem to be able to act very effectively often, it's because historically this country was founded by rebels who distrusted government, didn't like authority, particularly didn't like central authority and centralized authority. And so you ended up with, first, a federal system, and secondly, institutions, even under the Constitution. This filibuster thing, you know, it's not in the Constitution. It's not even part of statutory law. It's a congressional rule. But it's now being used by both parties, by the way, to virtually guarantee that if you're going to get anything done in the Senate, you have to have 60 votes. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that. The Constitution is very specific about the 5 situations in which a supermajority is required. And there's a lot that continues. I mean, listen to the Tea Party people. They don't want a strong national government particularly. They're not wild about government generally, but they hate the notion of a powerful government, which, for example, might even make it possible for working Americans and their families to have decent, affordable health care. And in point of fact, we've just had a decision by the Supreme Court of the United States, 5-4, which barely approved that, and includes some things in there which I think are crazy, but which raise serious questions about the authority of the federal government to pass important social and economic legislation. I mean, we're back at the New Deal. We're back with a huge court with these guys. So, so you have to understand, I think, that historical background. And one of these 5 guys, a guy named Scalia, was a classmate of mine. across the street. I mean, even then he was to the right of Marie Antoinette. He was a very conservative guy. But the notion that the federal government cannot regulate a part of our economy which represents 20% of the American economy, that's healthcare. And an opinion that at least Scalia participated in, when a few years ago he said the federal government could regulate somebody's backyard marijuana patch under the Commerce Clause. I mean, you figure it out. I can't. But it's a reflection of the fact that I guess we have a continuing debate in this country over the wisdom and constitutionality of a national government that can act in important economic areas, can act when it comes to health care, environmental regulation, and a lot of other things. So there are historical roots in all of this. And this may be strange for many of you to understand. Look, it's strange for many of us to understand. You know, 80, 90 years after the New Deal, but it's still out there.
So let's take some questions, or comments, or disagreements.
Yeah, and feel free to disagree here. Particularly interested in those of you who are international and
Do we have the mic? Do we have a mic available for the questioners?
No microphone?
We had one earlier.
Here we go.
Yeah, please.
Somebody right here.
I have a question in a loud voice, thank you.
Great.
We think of the U.S. as a very diverse country with many different points of view and perspectives spread all around the country, and yet it's disillusioning to look at a chart of which presidential candidate is ahead in which part of the country, because one presidential candidate has New England, the northern Midwest and the West Coast, and the other has just about everywhere else. So I'm wondering if this separation, geographic separation, could make reconciliation more difficult, more of a challenge after the election.
It's a good question. You all heard that? You know, we got red states, we got blue states. I guess they're calling some states purple states. I think a lot of this is the fault of my party. I think a lot of it is the fault of my party. I mean, I carried West Virginia by 12 percentage points in 1988. Why aren't we going to win West Virginia this time? What is West Virginia? Lots of working folks. One would think that they would have beliefs that are a lot closer to the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. I just think my party has done a very good job of making the case to those people. Take health care, for example. We now have approximately 90 million people in the United States of America who either have no health insurance or very poor health insurance. You know, $10,000 deductible policy. We used to call those buffalo policies. You all know what a buffalo policy is, right? No? Never heard of a buffalo policy? It covers you with health insurance, but only if you're hit by a buffalo on Main Street at noontime. Otherwise, you don't get it, okay? So 90 million people effectively don't have, either have no health insurance. And of course, when they get so sick that they can't stand up, they go to the emergency room at 10 times the cost of going to the doctor in the first place. And we're all paying for that. So what have the Democrats been saying about this health care bill? Well, it gets rid of pre-existing conditions, you can keep your kids on until they're 26, all of these are good things. But, and remember, consider the source. If I'd been a more effective communicator in 1988, I really would be here in a different capacity. In my opinion, this is all about whether or not working Americans and their families are going to have decent, affordable health care. Who's saying that? Nobody, particularly on the Democratic side. Now, if you go out and take a poll tomorrow and ask the American people, should working Americans and their families have decent, affordable health care, 93% say yes. So why aren't the Democrats saying this? I don't understand it. So don't be surprised if those working folks in West Virginia or Kentucky or Mississippi, for that matter, aren't voting Democratic. You're not talking to people about things they care about. If you're not helping them to understand that you're trying to do things that are in their best interest, then the other stuff will pull them over. I mean, Obama, at one point in 08, was 5 points behind McCain in Mississippi. There was no effective Democratic campaign for the presidency in Mississippi. Why not? Well, it's a red state. I don't buy that. I think the Democrats ought to be competing in every state. They're not doing so. No, the Republicans aren't either. And thanks to another quaint American institution called the Electoral College, which should have been abolished 150 years ago, we now have a presidential campaign that seems to be limited to about 7 states. And let me tell you, as a candidate, there's nothing more boring than that kind of campaign. What do? You get up in the morning, you're either in Michigan, maybe Wisconsin, certainly Ohio, probably Pennsylvania, definitely Virginia, definitely North Carolina, and definitely Florida. Last time Missouri was in there too. So that's it. Michigan. I guess I didn't go to Wisconsin. We had that in pretty good shape. Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, Missouri, Michigan. Right? And the rest of the country is kind of sitting there, spectators. I think my party's got to do better than that. I think my party's got to do better than that. Because you go out, as you know, and you ask the people in the so-called red states how they feel about affordable care for working families and how they feel about Social Security and Medicare. They're with us. So how come they're voting the other way? That's our fate. That's our fate. My view. Hold on.
As this conference is about reconciliation, what makes you think that Obama is going to do this when he gets re-elected after he had this wonderful opportunity after his extremely unseen victory 4 years ago?
Well, this is not a satisfactory answer, but I know the other guy. There's not the slightest chance he would. Okay? I understand. That's not a satisfactory answer, but you have to begin by at least considering that seriously. Well, my hope and expectation is, you remember that little exchange with, who was it? The former Russian president, who's now the prime minister. Yeah, where he said, you know, if I get through this, I'll have a little more flexibility. I think he probably was reflecting his view of the situation. But I think Obama's a guy who is a consensus builder. He's got a good sense of history, though I'm very concerned about this pivot to Asia, and this, three new supercarriers at a total cost of $42 billion. What do you think of that? Now look, I was just a lowly GI who spent 16 months, 1955, 56, 57, close to the DMZ in Korea, so I'm not an expert, but the little I know about military technology tells me that if there's anything more vulnerable than a supercarrier sitting out there in the middle of the ocean that can be blown up by a missile from 5,000 miles away, I don't know it. Do you? And we're going to spend $42 billion on 3 supercarriers. So, first, I think Obama is much more inclined to move in the direction that I'd like to see him move, even though I'm concerned about some of the stuff that we're seeing lately. And secondly, I think he will be in a position in a second term to do that. But would I like to see a more vigorous move in that direction? Yeah. Now, that doesn't mean I have easy answers, folks. I mean, the Middle East is going to be pretty turbulent for some time. I mean, all these folks come over here, they go to American universities, they get PhDs, they learn all about democracy, and they go back there and they believe it. And that can be quite confusing and disruptive. So I think we've got to be very careful about military intervention and these kinds of things. But I know one thing. I mean, I don't have any doubt that at least given what I've been expressing, Obama is much more likely to follow that policy path than Brother Romney, I can tell you that. I mean, somebody said the other day that every time Romney picks up a piece of foreign policy, he breaks it.
So, anyone on this side of the, please, yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah.
This me?
Hold on. We gotta,
Sorry. Two short questions.
Sure.
The first, I'm not sure how many democratically elected leaders there are in 200 countries, but I'm wondering whether countries like Australia, which require people to vote or be fined, have results that are better for consensus building and less for polarization. That's the first question.
Okay.
The second question is, can you think of an example where the American government has surrendered its sovereignty to the World Court in a property adjudication?
Well, the answer to the second question is it's not easy. It's very frustrating. But when the court, if I remember this correctly, either handed down a decision or certainly acted, I think it handed down a decision declaring our activities in Nicaragua illegal. We basically said we would no longer accept the jurisdiction of the court, even though it was an American on the court, which tells you at this point. Now, I'd like to see the president, if he's reelected, reverse that. I'd like to see the president reverse that. A little difficult to tell people to go to the International Court of Justice if you won't accept its jurisdiction in your own case. And we all know the story about the U.S. and the International Criminal Court. We use it, but only when it suits our purposes. But we won't accept its general jurisdiction. Well, I mean, we all know what that means in terms of our credibility and the credibility of the court itself. The United States is prepared to do this. On the other hand, we have joined certain international institutions and given up a degree of our sovereignty, World Trade Organization for one, and there are some others. But that's where we are at this point. First question.
The first question was about the privilege of living in a democracy but being asked to
You
vote.
required to vote?
Does that render a more consensual government or a less consensual
Good
government?
question. Any Australians in the room? I don't know that Australian politics is any. I don't know that Australian politics is any less contentious than American politics. I mean, they have two major political parties that do a pretty good job of beating each other up, and there are serious philosophical differences between them. Incidentally, they're going to be blessed with 2,500 Marines, you know that, who are going to Australia. To do what? Now, great for the Marines, folks. Australia's a wonderful place, great-looking women, they love Yanks. I mean, I'd love to be assigned to Australia, but I'm not quite sure what this is all about. But I don't think a parliamentary system necessarily is any less contentious. The only thing it does is give an elected majority a chance to act. And normally they do, for better or for worse. Whereas we have this kind of ongoing semi-gridlock, which occasionally produces results, a lot of frustration, but maybe, at least in some ways, keeps us from doing unwise things. That's the theory, anyway. Who's next? Please. Then we'll come back. Oh, sorry.
I have a question. I'd like to sort of dispute a point you made. I'm sure, like most Americans, you're concerned about the money in political campaigns.
Yeah.
Okay. I was involved a number of years ago in several presidential campaigns just as an organizer, and so I'm aware of the dynamics of these campaigns.
Yeah.
If you remove the Electoral College,
Yeah.
campaigns would simply turn into media markets. And then all the money would simply go into the biggest media markets, and that would be it. The only thing that prevents that is the Electoral College. And the other issue is, given the, I'm sure you would agree with this, the fairly frequent proclivity for bad governmental decisions, I really question whether we want that efficient a system, whether an inefficient system is ultimately to our advantage.
Both good questions. Look, there's nothing efficient about politics. There never will be. I don't care what the system is. So you don't have to worry about that. It takes time to get things done in any political system. Why? Because there's lots of disagreement, and it's reflected in the political system. So I don't think you have to worry that much about the possibility that maybe we might do some more things that have strong public support without taking forever to do it. I don't agree with you when it comes to the Electoral College. If we abolish the Electoral College, every vote would count. Now, I'm not suggesting to you that the candidates would spend enormous amounts of time in Montana and North Dakota. But I'm a huge believer in precinct-based grassroots organizing. And I don't think there's any question that the Obama campaign demonstrated in 2008 that that kind of campaign can win for the presidency as well as for local office. And even though money presumably will be spent in large media markets, more, that certainly doesn't preclude. As a matter of fact, I think it puts a priority on precinct-based grassroots organizing in every state in the country, and a campaign in every state in the country. What do we got now? We're all kind of bystanders. While the candidates run frantically from one state to the other, 7 states total, or whatever it is. Throw in Nevada, make it 8. Throw in Colorado, make it 9. I think that's a terribly distorted political system. But if I were running for the presidency under a system where every vote counted for 1, believe me, we'd organize every one of the 200,000 precincts of the country, and that's all we got, each of which has roughly 2,000, 2,500 voters, 1,000, 1,500 households, every one of them, with a precinct captain, 6 block captains, making personal contact with every single voting household on an ongoing basis. We don't have that today, folks. We don't have that today. And I think we're much the worse for it. I'm for getting rid of the Electoral College, which is a profoundly undemocratic institution in the first place, as all of you know. I mean, it was basically designed by people that didn't want average voters to vote for the presidency.
Okay, last question right here, please. Yes.
My name is Tran. I am a physical scientist. Governor, I voted for you in 1988.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry we didn't do better.
And therefore, I consider to be you to be my president as well. But since the chairman mentioned something about expanding this session to international issues as well, we are here with the Tong Academy. Frankly, to the world, Tong was not very well known. We only the Vietnamese who knew that 700 years ago there was a king who was for reconciliation and who was also for the unity for the country against foreign domination. Now we have a lot of polarization in Vietnam. It's very intractable. We have polarization in values, in politics, in wealth. If you were a Vietnamese leader or a Vietnamese citizen, what would you do in the situation?
What you're facing is not very different from what many, many nations have faced. Remember, this country was a colonial country, dominated by, owned by, controlled by a foreign power. And even after we went to war against them, got rid of them, we really had decades of conflict, which led to the Civil War. And then more decades of conflict. Over what? Over the issue of race, which we're still working on. Well, God knows we made a lot of progress. But until the Civil Rights Revolution, people of color in this country didn't have political rights, and they didn't have civil rights. a black defendant in a southern court was gone. They didn't have employment rights. So this is not an instant process. You just have to keep working at it. And sometimes it means taking risks, as I'm sure I don't have to tell you. But it's worth the battle. And if we can at least create an international environment, an international institutions which are supportive of these kinds of efforts, so that you at least have some help from an international community committed to those values. Steve Walt talked about what's happened in Europe, notwithstanding the current economic situation. And now it has a common community. May or may not have a common currency, but I don't know that that's, quite frankly, I don't know if that's most importantly, has in effect a regional constitution and a growing body of European community law. I mean, all of this is just remarkable if you know anything about it. And I believe it's possible for that to happen other places too. It won't happen overnight. Wish it could, but it won't. And by the way, democracy in the United States is a work in progress. Look at this voter suppression stuff that's going on. I mean, what is that anyway? It's nothing but an effort to try to make it difficult, if not impossible, for poor folks, many of them people of color, to vote. 750,000 registered voters in Pennsylvania don't have a photo ID. These are registered voters. They just don't happen to own an automobile, have a license, or whatever. And it just so happens that Obama's margin of victory in Pennsylvania was 750,000. What's going on here? Well, in this case, sorry to be a little partisan, Republican legislatures are doing their best to make it difficult for these folks to vote because they know they're more likely to vote for Democrats. And it's disgraceful. It's outrageous. Now, federal law under the Civil Rights Act permits the Justice Department to intervene, but only in those states that historically discriminated against people of color when it came to voting. So the Justice Department can intervene in Florida, can intervene, where is it, Alabama? I don't know where it is, and get the federal courts to act. Under the existing law, it can't intervene in Indiana, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, because they weren't states that, at the time, in 1965, were discriminating on the basis of race. But it's outrageous. You know, Scott Brown attacking Elizabeth Warren because her daughter is the chairman of the board of a nonprofit that is trying to get a number of states, including Massachusetts, to do what the federal law requires it to do. And that is notify poor people, members of the National Guard. I don't know that Brown, maybe he objects to that too, I don't know. I don't think so. To just make sure they know what they have to do in order to register to vote. Why is he upset? Because those folks are more likely to vote for Elizabeth Warren than for him, I guess. But I don't care what the partisan thing's all about. I think the whole thing's outrageous. So, don't kid yourself. We've got to work at making this a more perfect democracy every day. And so do you. And I just hope that the United States, in the best sense of the word, will be a force for supporting, reinforcing. As you can see, I mean, it's not an easy thing. I mean, Putin has just told us that he wants us out of Russia when it comes to helping these nonprofits that presumably are designed to help build a democracy in Russia. Well, okay, you know, if he doesn't want the 50 million, I guess we'll have to give it to somebody else, but or maybe just save it, balance the budget. But it's, you know, I think all of us are very supportive of efforts on the part of so many of you to move toward genuine democracy, but we ought to be the first people to recognize that this is a very difficult task, and it never stops. It never stops.
Well, Governor Dukakis, the governor has made reference a couple of times to a job he didn't get. I want to tell you about the job that he does have, that many of us professors would love to have. The governor is a distinguished professor at Northeastern, one of the sister institutions here at Harvard in Boston. And I know the Fulbrights are going over, I think later today, to Northeastern. That's his fall gig. In the wintertime, he has a position at UCLA, so he's out in sunny California. And there aren't very many professors that have been able to negotiate that kind of arrangement, and we're delighted that you were here today with us.
It's a terrible, look, it's a terrible burden. Somebody's got to do it. But I do want you to know that Northeastern is a year-round school, as many of you know. So I come back and I start teaching in May, right through the summer.
Spring. Beautiful
Summer
spring.
and fall. And we love New England, and I don't have to tell you how I feel about this state and about Boston and so forth. I don't want you to think it. But we do have two daughters, one in Denver, one in San Francisco, each with 2 kids. So we got, of our 8 grandkids, four of them are in the West. So that's my rationale for it. But it's a hell of a lot of fun. And it's not a bad place to spend a winter, I must admit.
Well, Mike, thanks so much. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll take them out. I have to fit after 6:30 because I have like there is a. I have to fit after 6:30. I have to fit after 6:30 because I have like there is a.